Hello, welcome to this video. We're going to install OpenShift 4.7 on Azure using IPI, or the Installer Provision Infrastructure, but we're going to leverage external DNS. Well, sorta. So most of the time when you create an Azure implementation for OpenShift, one of the requirements, or one of the steps, I don't know, guidance, it's not really a requirement, but guidance is to create your DNS zone within Azure, and then migrate or update the DNS, your name service records, to the Azure DNS. Now, obviously, that's not going to work for everybody because you might have a domain already that you've been using for years. So there's no sense of you migrating that domain to Azure just for the sake of deploying OpenShift. So here's two ways that you can use external DNS to still provision OpenShift on Azure without migrating your primary DNS zone to Azure. Quick tutorial. I'm just going to kind of review the two ways, and then we'll do the install using the actual domain, so I can show you how that works. But I want to cover using a subdomain first. All right, so let's look at my GoDaddy instance here. So under GoDaddy, I have this domain that I typically use, just for these demos, and it really has no records in here. But the name servers are actually pointing to GoDaddy name servers. They're not pointing to anything within Azure, right? We take a look at our Azure environment. I have one resource group here, and the resource group has nothing in it right now, but we're actually going to put some stuff in here. All right, the first thing we need to create our DNS records. And again, what I was saying earlier is there's two ways. One is to migrate, or not really migrate. One is to create a subdomain and then point that subdomain from your DNS to Azure. I'm going to show you that one. And then the other way is to just essentially move your domain from the Azure records to your external DNS. And I'll show you that. All right, so the first thing is, if we're going to create our OpenShift implementation and we're going to use a subdomain. So let's create a DNS zone. This is subdomain, right? So I'm just going to be creating a subdomain. And we'll say it's the subdomain is going to be redwagon.ocpnow.com. Actually, we're going to say it's OpenShift.ocpnow.com. All right, we'll create that. So my subdomain will be OpenShift.ocpnow.com. Create it. And once that domain is created, we can essentially point our subdomain records to these name servers. All right. Again, this is just doing a subdomain install. I'm not migrating my primary domain. So in this case, I could go to my configuration for DNS and then say, well, give me a name server, and the host is going to be what was it? OpenShift. .ocpnow.com, and it points to one of these. So you can see I'm just essentially anything that's looking for this domain would point to there. You see how that's working out, right? So my primary DNS still points to this domain on GoDaddy. I'm just saying that when I go to create my new domain, and actually I don't even know if that's right, it's probably just OpenShift, like that. I'll have to test that out. I can't remember how I did it for DNS zones. Okay, so then we just do another one, right? So add name server, and then I can grab another one here, copy, and OpenShift points to that. I think it was OCPnow.com. And we'll change this. And then there's two more zones, right? So I'm not going to do this build. I'm going to do the other one, but I'm just showing you. So essentially, you're creating name service entries for this subdomain to point to Azure. And then your cluster name would be like cluster dot, and then this is the domain, right? So this would be essentially your base domain using a subdomain, but I'm not migrating my primary DNS. I'm only pointing with these name service entries this subdomain to Azure. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is the one we're actually going to install. So let me get rid of these because I don't need those. Okay, and we will come here and let's delete the zone because I don't need that anymore. Okay, and then I'll go back into my resource group here and we'll add a new DNS zone. Now we're adding the DNS zone purely for automation. I'm not going to be migrating DNS to it. It's just there's the part of the IPI process is to create and inject those external DNS records for IPI and then for the asterisk or wildcard.apps for that domain. So I want to go ahead and allow it to create those records, which then we will move to our external DNS. All right, so now we've got ocpnow.com as our domain, which is in our resource group, and we're going to call the cluster redwagon, and so it's going to be redwagon.ocpnow.com. So under this DNS zone, it will create ipi.redwagon pointing to a CNAME, and it'll create asterisk.apps.redwagon pointing to an IP address. Now, knowing that, I want to go ahead and come back to my DNS, and I want to add those records now. So I know that one's going to be a CNAME, and it's going to be api.redwagon is my cluster name, and it's going to point to a CNAME or just some other name, someothername.com. Now, this is temporary, so we're going to set this to 600 seconds. Now, why 600 seconds? Because I want it to update frequently. All right, because I only have about 20 minutes by the time it injects that record into DNS to copy it into this zone, the for real one that it's going to put in here. It's going to copy it into that zone. All right, so I'm going to set that as a really quick update time. All right, so this is our first one, api.redwagon. Our next one that we're going to create is actually an A record, and it's going to point to an IP address. And this is for star.apps.redwagon. And it's going to point to an IP address like 1.2.3.4. And again, we're going to set this to something really quick. Click 600 and click Save. All right, so this is what's being populated or presented. If we did a dig, we'll get something goofy like this. But again, we're not actually routing to it. This is just, I'm just filling in some really quick, just kind of placeholders for me to get, and this is just how I'm doing it. You can do this after the fact if you want, but this is how I'm doing it. Just so I have some placeholders to update. All right, and it will, again, part of the install, we'll create those records here. I'm not using these DNS. I'm going to say this again. The DNS is still coming from GoDaddy. All right, so now we've got our instance. All right, so if we take a look here, we can look at, let's go to Redwagon, cd into the Redwagon directory, and we'll vi the install config file, and you'll see OCP now is the base domain, right, which is the base domain, OCP now, which is also the actual domain here. And then my cluster name is Redwagon, which is what we've allocated our resources to right there, right there. All right, and then this is all basic, and leave this publishing external so we get those records created right here. I haven't made any other changes to this. All right, so let's go ahead and save that out. And then we can just do, let me back up the directory here. OpenShift install create cluster directory equals Redwagon. All right, so I've already got stored credentials for my Azure environment, so it'll go ahead and use those credentials. If not, it'll prompt you for your login and your system ID or service principal ID. It'll ask you for that. It's part of the normal install process. Again, I'm not showing you the full IPI install. I'm just showing you how you can leverage external DNS to point to your installation. Okay, so now it's creating those infrastructure resources. So we can go to all resources here, nothing there. And essentially we're going to have a new resource group with IPI get created. And it'll be redwagon dot or dash some weird 5 characters dash RG, and then inside that resource group it'll create all of its artifacts. The only thing I've got here in this resource group is just the domain, right? That is not pointing to anything. All right, so let's go back here, just click refresh, and this is going to take a few minutes. Look at all resources here. We see that the networking is starting to be created, and you'll see that it created this private zone. Now this private zone is just used internally for the cluster. It's not pointing to DNS, so you just ignore the private zone. Again, it's just for the cluster so that the nodes can identify each other. So just leave this alone. You will see some records created here. That's because the worker nodes will request API int, and some things within the environment may just request for API, so that's in there. And you may also see the asterisk apps in here because you can loop back from those environments. So, but this is all this is all private networking. It's all within the resource group, so you can ignore that one. When we go to OCP now, we see this API redwagon record, and if you remember, we put this as a temporary into our DNS. So let's select that, and we'll grab this record here, and we will go ahead and put it in our CNAME here. So now anything that goes to api.redwagon.ocpnow.com will point to there, right there. All right, all resources. And once it gets done, it's going to create that other record for the asterisk apps, and then we'll add that record in there. So again, we're not migrating any DNS. I'm still using the DNS from GoDaddy here. All right, this is going to take a few minutes. Okay, so we put in that API resolution here, and you can see that, bam, it found it, right? So if it wouldn't, it would have timed out. And again, so we got a short window here for it to find it. That's why I set this to 600 seconds, right? Because we need to do that. Now, once the install is done, obviously I probably want to move that up to an hour, but during the install, keep it really low like that. All right, so let's go take a look here. Let me refresh, see where we're at. Blah, blah, nothing. All right, I'm going to check the DNS record again. Nothing there. Okay. All right, so now we just got to wait for the worker nodes to come up, and once they start being provisioned, then we'll get our wildcard record from OCP Now domain. All right, so I'll be right back. Okay, so hit refresh a moment ago. We now have our IP address for that wildcard, so let's go ahead and grab that, and we'll move that to GoDaddy as well. Here we go. That's really all there is to it. Now that, and again, I'm not using these name servers, right? So essentially at this point, I could just delete that resource. It's not doing anything, but we'll wait for the cluster to finish here, and then it'll give us the access to the console. We'll know we'll have that and the login, and once I show you that I can get to it, we'll be all wrapped up. Looks like our configuration's done here. Let's refresh that. All right, and we've got our console access right here. So we will just fire up the browser, go there, and we are accessing it, ingressing into our environment. Should give me, yeah, one more time. This is normal since they're self-signed certs. And we'll log in. There we go. So we have our shiny new cluster on Azure. And like I said, essentially you could just go through, where is it? And just get rid of this DNS now. It's not needed. If you don't want to use it, that's fine. I should also mention that if you could not update your DNS, right, like I did right here, but if you have to like put in a ticket or whatever, I would, these have to be in there in order for you to ingress into the environment, unless you created an install server in in your Azure environment. So let's say in this resource group, I would create like a Bastion host and then do all the installs from the Bastion host. I should be able to set the name services in that Bastion server for that domain to be this DNS server, right? So then it can resolve these addresses. Then I would be able to access that environment. So keep that in mind too. That if you can't update the DNS records right away, like I did, just create a Bastion host within your Azure environment that you're going to be installing in, and then you'll be able to resolve it and then continue the install like I've done here. All right, so that's all for this video. Again, what we've done is we talked about the first step. The second step is doing this migration. The first way is to create a subdomain and then just point those name server to that subdomain for that subdomain rather in Azure. All right. The second way is to allow Azure to create the records for us in the normal process and then move those records to our external DNS server like we've done here on GoDaddy. All right. Thanks a lot. Like, subscribe, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks a lot.